John Betjeman said childhood is measured out in sights, sounds and smells, before the dark hour of reason grows. Shine On You Crazy Diamond is a luminous, yet conversely desolate number that perfectly encapsulates and reflects the brilliant and bright essence that was Syd Barrett. All this accompanied by Richard Wright's elegiac mini-moog flourishes. You get that graceful yet mournful swell which evokes an atmosphere of quiet regret. And how resting is that 4-note guitar arpeggio from Gilmour. A 4-note arpeggio that, according to Gilmour, sounded like the lingering ghost of Syd Barrett. Of course, the wistful guitar phrasing and elegiac keyboard swell very much defines this haunting and indeed haunted number. A number, of course, troubled by the memory of Syd Barrett, who rattles his chains from the margins of this one like Banquo's ghost. And the band were experiencing what can only be described as an existential crisis at this point, and that sense of loss, of absence, informs the atmosphere of this album. In fact, the working title of this album was actually Variations on a Theme of Absence. When considering the follow-up to 1973's Dark Side of the Moon, Gilmour wanted to include tracks that had already been thrashed out in the live forum, namely Raving, Drooling and You've Got to Be Crazy, which of course much later on formed part of Waters' Orwellian beast fable, as I call it. But Waters felt he wanted something more thematic and decided that Shine On should bookend the album, despite Gilmour suggesting it should occupy the whole of one side. And Waters was correct, because this track structurally is perfectly placed on this album, an album that addresses themes such as loneliness, isolation, the music industry and alienation, and it places all those themes within the context of Syd's story. And these elements then are presented within the wider context of Syd's decline, as well as a harsh critique of the almost commercial and political machinations of the music industry. This album perfectly exemplifies the point made by Robert Frost, where poetry is about grief, politics is about the grievance. Floyd would often explore these cohesive and thematic threads, usually within the context of these expanded pieces, using a slow harmonic pace. Echoes would be a perfect example of that, a track that marks a transition from the band's experimental era into their mature, carefully organised style. And one can trace the band's development, as does Gilmour, from Medal onwards and that arresting ping of echoes. But I would argue that Atom Heart Mother is also a vital cog in that machine. Nevertheless, the harmonic skeleton of this track, from which everything else clings, certainly sets the tone for the album. I read a fascinating article about Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where the chap states that this track reflects the 5 psychological stages of grief. And he states that those stages are, of course, a numbness, followed by yearning, anger, depression, and finally acceptance. The slow pulse of Rick's synth playing here, no doubt with fingers still wet from running around the rims of those wine glasses, is punctuated by the agonising yearning and screams of Gilmour's guitar. And that's before Waters addresses the subject in a series of extended metaphors that focus the listener's attention on the idea of something being bright and dazzling, yet ultimately tragic. And this idea of bereavement is explored beautifully within this thematic arc of the song, which imbues the piece with a raw yet genuine expression of grief, which gives this track its almost structural framework. Even exploring a range of emotions, even Waters' strangulated bark. He seems to admonish Syd for "you wore out your welcome," before it returns with its glowing tribute to a lost talent, that seer of visions. Shine On You Crazy Diamond feels like a classical tone poem, a shimmering, beautiful yet desolate piece. It does unite the work thematically and of course establishes the major musical and lyrical themes within the context of Syd's story, which is why the image of the Crazy Diamond is contained or explores other narratives about fame, loss, and how the music machine just burns you up. But arguably one of the most moving moments of this piece is Richard Wright's See Emily Play refrain at the very end of the piece. Shine On You Crazy Diamond is an atmospheric piece that begins with a familiar, haunting, atmospheric drone and progresses through various different musical styles from funk bass lines, blues-influenced guitar and synth jams. And this track is made even more poignant by the fact that Syd Barrett wanders into the studio while the band were recording and mixing this album, an album that in part is inspired by his story. I walked into the studio at Abbey Road. Roger was sitting, mixing at the desk, and I saw this big bald guy sitting on the couch behind. Recalls Richard Wright in the illustrated discography of Pink Floyd. And I didn't think anything of it. In those days, it was quite normal for strangers to wander into our sessions. Then Roger Waters said, "You don't know who that guy is, do you? It's Syd." It was a huge shock, because I hadn't seen him for about 6 years. He kept standing up and brushing his teeth, putting his toothbrush away and sitting down. Then at one point he stood up and said, "Right, when do I put the guitar on?" And of course he didn't have a guitar with him, and we said, "Sorry Syd, the guitar's all done." When Syd was asked what he thought of the music, he said it sounded a bit old. And Waters' lyrics very much reflect a man trying to reconcile himself with the band's part in Barrett's story, perhaps, and that loss of something very special. Remember when you were young, you shone like the sun, shine on you crazy diamond. Now there's a look in your eyes like black holes in the sky, shine on you crazy diamond. And Waters beautifully explores in his writing that Floydian motif that is madness, one that he'd been writing about really since 1968. And of course it was a theme that was touched upon on the wonderful conceptual masterpiece that is Dark Side of the Moon. There was something Blakean about Syd's story as Waters frames it. Of course he's connected with his childhood self, the innocent, truer self, but also that fine line between genius and madness. "You reached for the secret too soon," Waters sings at one point, before describing Barrett as a seer of visions. "Come on, you painter, you piper, you prisoner." Interestingly, Michel Foucault's work Madness and Civilization, he talks about the insane being seers and visionaries, and in some respects were treated as such. And he beautifully evokes the image of the ship of fools drifting eerily through the fog with its passengers in search of their reason. "Come on, you miner, for truth and delusion, and shine." I will always imagine the soul of Syd Barrett occupying the pages of Hilaire Belloc or those Alice books. That nursery rhyme aesthetic and romantic whimsy, those sing-song cadences, before too much was demanded of him. To remind you of the Betjeman quote at the start of this video, childhood is measured out in sights, smells and sounds, before the dark hour of reason grows. You've been watching a video by Classic Album Review. If you've enjoyed this, please do share it and check that notification bell so you don't miss out on any content. I will leave you with my closing salvo, which is hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.